Ever get that feeling that, what's being discussed in the news today has roots stretching way, way back, but those connections just aren't being made clear?
Oh, absolutely.
Like you're trying to understand a tree just by looking at its newest leaves, maybe.
That's a great analogy, and it's precisely the challenge, isn't it? So often, these conversations start somewhere in the middle. They completely overlook centuries of history that really shaped the present.
Right.
So our goal here in this deep dive, using the source material you provided, especially that YouTube discussion with Raymond Ibrahim, is really to unearth those, let's say, foundational layers.
Okay.
We're here to sort of guide you through some complex, but I think essential information, aiming for those, aha moments that can really light up the bigger picture.
Exactly. We're not here to just rattle off a dry list of dates and battles. We want to connect the dots, right, in a way that gives you a real grasp of why things have unfolded the way they have.
Mm.
And to help us navigate all this, we have an expert with, well, a pretty remarkable background. Born of Egyptian Coptic heritage, fluent in Arabic,
Yes.
deep studies in history, including medieval Islam and Byzantium under Victor Davis Hanson, who actually wrote the forewords to his books,
That's right, yeah.
an MA focusing on the pivotal Battle of Yarmouk, worked at the Library of Congress, author of several really significant books, Al-Qaeda Reader, Crucified Again, Sword and Scimitar, Defenders of the West.
And perhaps a little anecdote that's kind of telling. My YouTube bio once jokingly mentioned being canceled. It referred to a situation with the U.S. Army War College. They initially rescinded an invitation, then re-invited me after some, well, debate.
Wow.
It's just a small illustration, really, of the sensitivities that still surround these historical topics, even
Yeah,
today.
absolutely. It really highlights that. So, okay, before we dive into specific events, let's tackle a really common misconception. This idea that the Middle East and North Africa were, always predominantly Muslim.
Right. That's crucial because the reality, as Islam was emerging, is that these regions, Egypt, what we call Greater Syria, so modern Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Anatolia, which is now Turkey, they were overwhelmingly Christian.
More Christian than Europe at the time.
Significantly more Christian than Europe. You have to remember the five major centers, the ancient seas of early Christianity: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople.
Okay.
Think about that. All of them, except Rome, eventually fell under Islamic conquest. That fundamentally altered the religious map of the world. It's something that's often just forgotten.
Okay, so if we're looking for a key starting point, maybe a military turning point, where does this long, often turbulent interaction really kick off?
Well, the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD, it's widely seen as a watershed moment. The source you mentioned, Ibrahim, really emphasizes this as the beginning, the military beginning, of the sustained conflict between Christendom and the expanding Islamic Caliphate.
Okay, 636. So help us picture the situation then. What was the context? What was happening around that time?
Right, so this is just 4 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632. The nascent Muslim community under the first two caliphs, Abu Bakr and then Omar, had just consolidated its power through something called the Ridda Wars,
The Ridda Wars.
sometimes called the Apostasy Wars. And it's worth noting here, you see this in the hadith collections like Sahih Bukhari. The idea of punishing those who left Islam, apostasy, was already, well, established in early Islamic thought.
So a new power was solidifying and starting to look outwards. What actually happened at Yarmouk?
The battle itself took place in Syria. Syria was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, then what we usually call Byzantium. It pitted the Byzantine army, a major military force of its day, against these rapidly advancing Arab Muslim armies.
And the outcome?
Despite Byzantine strength, the Muslims won decisively. Some accounts, historical accounts, even mention a huge desert storm that might have played a role, perhaps giving the desert-adapted Arab forces an edge, on that terrain.
And this wasn't just some minor border skirmish, right? It had bigger implications.
Oh, far from it. Yarmouk became absolutely foundational in Islamic historical memory. Even today, you see extremist groups like ISIS invoking figures and events from that battle that quote commanders like Khalid bin al-Walid. There's that chilling line attributed to him: "We've tasted Roman blood, and none is sweeter."
Wow. That really shows how deep these historical narratives can run.
Exactly. It illustrates how these early victories continue to resonate, at least within certain parts of the Islamic world.
So what were the immediate consequences of this victory in Yarmouk?
The impact was incredibly swift and far-reaching. Egypt, which was a vital, wealthy province of the Roman Empire, fell to the Muslim armies just a few years later, around 640, 641.
And Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, a city of immense spiritual importance for Christians, was conquered just 1 year after Yarmouk. The momentum was just unstoppable. The Muslim conquests continued westward, right across North Africa at an astonishing pace.
Which naturally leads towards Europe itself. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain, becomes the next major area.
Precisely. By 732 AD, that's barely a century after Muhammad's death, Muslim forces had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, swept through Spain, which they started conquering in 711, and were deep into Western Europe, in what is now
A
France.
century. That's incredibly fast.
It is. And then you have the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, in 732. That's where Frankish forces under Charles Martel met the advancing Muslim armies. It's often seen as, well, a crucial point. It basically halted that specific large-scale push further into the heart of Europe from Spain.
So just to recap the scale here.
Yeah.
Within about 100 years, something like 3/4 of the original Christian world had been conquered.
That's about right. 3/4 of the lands that were Christian when Muhammad began his mission were now under Muslim rule, permanently, in most cases.
Permanently.
And it wasn't just the mainland. Think about the Mediterranean islands, Sicily, Malta, Cyprus, Rhodes. They were also conquered and held for, considerable periods.
It really throws into sharp relief how much the modern perception that these have sort of always been Muslim regions clashes with that historical reality.
It absolutely does.
Now, was this expansion, this conquest, was it peaceful? Sometimes you hear narratives suggesting a more benign process.
Well, the historical records, both from European sources and perhaps surprisingly, often even more vividly in the Arab and Islamic chronicles themselves, they clearly show these conquests as violent military campaigns involving significant bloodshed, displacement of populations, enslavement. Some of the Arab accounts from the time actually celebrate the violence against the Christian infidels. They boast about destroying churches as proof of their piety and, God's favor.
Right. Okay, this brings us to that period in European history often called the Dark Ages. How does this era connect with the Islamic expansion we've been discussing?
The traditional view of the Dark Ages really needs, I think, a significant reevaluation because of the impact of Islamic expansion. The Muslim conquest fundamentally fractured the Mediterranean world. It used to be a unifying Roman lake, right? That was gone. The established trade routes, the communication links between Europe and the East Egypt, Syria, and North Africa were severely disrupted. Cut off, really. This led to economic and cultural isolation in Europe. Even the supply of basic things like papyrus from Egypt, it just stopped.
A dramatic shift, then, in the whole geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely massive. There's the famous historian Henri Pirenne. He argued very influentially that without Muhammad, there'd be no Charlemagne.
What do you mean by that?
His thesis, essentially, is that the rise of the Frankish state, and ultimately a distinct Western European identity, happened because of Islamic expansion and the breakdown of that Mediterranean unity. Europe was forced onto its own path, largely cut off from the, frankly, more developed Eastern world at that time.
And the effects weren't just political and economic.
Not at all. Think about the Viking slave raids, for instance. Where did many of those slaves end up? A significant number, captured in places like Ireland, England, France, were sold into the huge Arab slave markets, often through the river routes in what's now Russia.
Is there evidence for that?
Oh, yes. Finding Arab coins, dirhams, in Viking hordes across Scandinavia provides pretty concrete evidence of this connection.
So, as the source material quotes another historian, Islam was a midwife to Europe. It sounds like this constant pressure forced a particular kind of development, a defensive one.
Precisely. The ongoing threat, the sheer scale of the territory lost to Islamic expansion, remember those 3/4 of the Christian world, it absolutely played a crucial role in shaping Europe's martial culture, its fortifications, its whole defensive posture. They knew exactly what had been lost.
Given this incredible speed and success of the early Muslim conquests, what are some of the theories historians offer to explain it? Why were they so successful so quickly?
Well, there were likely several factors converging. The two big superpowers of the day, the Eastern Roman, Byzantine, and the Persian Sasanian empires, had just fought each other to exhaustion in a long series of devastating wars. They were weakened, vulnerable.
Okay, that makes sense.
From the Muslim perspective, their victories were seen as clear proof of divine favor, God being on their side. And on the Christian side, contemporary interpretations often saw the conquests as, well, divine punishment for their sins.
What about Edward Gibbon's famous argument? that Christianity itself had somehow softened the Roman military spirit.
Ah, Gibbon. Yes, his thesis in Decline and Fall is very well known, but it's highly debatable. If you actually look at the historical records from that time, you find plenty of examples of fiercely martial Christians and Christian states.
So it wasn't necessarily a lack of fighting spirit.
It's hard to make a strong case that Christianity inherently led to military decline. Other factors, like those prior wars, internal political problems, likely played much bigger roles.
So eventually Europe starts to push back.
Mhm.
We mentioned the Battle of Tours, halting one major advance. But what about regaining the territory that was lost, especially in Spain?
Right. Tours was crucial for halting the push into France. But in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, the resistance started much earlier, almost immediately after the conquest. Remnants of the Visigothic kingdom held out in the mountainous north.
And that resistance grew.
Yes, it laid the foundation for what became a much longer, centuries-long effort, the Reconquista. It started with figures like Pelagius in the northwest. From there, Christian kingdoms gradually, painstakingly began the process of reclaiming Spain from Muslim rule.
An 800-year struggle, that's just
Yeah,
an immense period of conflict.
it really is. Spain essentially became a microcosm, a focal point for the wider, ongoing Christian-Muslim conflict. And even for the Christians living under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, life wasn't always easy. They had dhimmi-status second-class citizens and often faced periods of intense persecution, especially when the wars between the Muslim South and the Christian North heated up.
We often hear about Al-Andalus being this golden age of tolerance and harmony. How accurate is that picture?
That popular image of a consistently tolerant, peaceful Al-Andalus. Well, it's largely a myth. Modern scholarship has really challenged that romanticized view.
So there were conflicts.
Absolutely. Yes, there were periods of relative coexistence, cultural exchange, certainly, but there were also significant recurring episodes of persecution. Look at the martyrs of Cordoba in the 9th century, for example. They're well documented. Historians like Dario Fernandez Morera have done a lot to debunk the myth.
Yeah, and the economy.
Well, part of Al-Andalus's prosperity was built on, frankly, plunder from raids into Christian lands and a very active slave trade, largely involving Europeans captured in those raids or further afield. Forced conversions also happened, and there was often a formal obligation for the rulers of Al-Andalus to launch annual military campaigns, jihads, against the northern Christian kingdoms.
Let's shift our focus back east for a moment. What was happening there in the lead up to what we now call the Crusades?
Okay, so in the Islamic world, power had shifted. The earlier Arab empires, the Umayyads and Abbasids, were less dominant. The Seljuk Turks, who were Sunni Muslims, had become the major power.
And their arrival changed things.
Yes. Starting around 1050 and really intensifying up to about 1090, there was a sharp increase in the persecution and outright destruction of Christian communities, particularly Armenians and Greeks, in Greater Armenia, that's Eastern Anatolia, modern Turkey.
Destruction like.
We're talking about the destruction of numerous churches, the famous 1001 churches of Anani, for instance, and the deliberate desecration of Christian symbols, crosses, icons. These actions seem very ideologically driven, a kind of foreshadowing of what groups like ISIS would do centuries later to religious minorities.
And this wasn't just happening in Anatolia. It affected pilgrims, too.
Definitely. Conditions for Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land got much worse under Seljuk rule. They faced more attacks, extortion. There was some truly horrific incidents, like a large German pilgrimage in 1065 that was attacked, massacred, women were raped, holy objects desecrated. It sent shockwaves back to Europe.
It sounds like things were reaching a breaking point. What was the specific trigger for the big European response, the First Crusade?
The major catalyst was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 in Asia Minor. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantine Empire. Their emperor, Romanos IV, was even captured.
And the result of that battle?
It basically opened the floodgates for Turkish settlement across Anatolia. This posed a direct existential threat to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. So facing this crisis, the Emperor Alexius the Komnenos sent urgent appeals to the West, asking for military help.
And the Pope responded.
Yes. Pope Urban II responded at the Council of Clermont in 1095. He gave a famous speech, vividly describing the atrocities against Christians in the East, the suffering of pilgrims, the threat to Byzantium, and he called for a military expedition, an armed pilgrimage, essentially.
To achieve what, specifically? What were the stated goals?
The primary motivations, as articulated then, were twofold. First, to liberate the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, from Muslim control, and second, to go to the aid of their fellow Christians in the East who were facing, increasing persecution and danger under the Seljuks.
Now, the modern view of the Crusades is, let's say, overwhelmingly negative, often portrayed as purely aggressive colonialist ventures. Is that the whole story?
Well, that contemporary narrative often strips away the historical context. It's important to remember, first, the centuries of prior Islamic expansion into Christian lands that we've just discussed, and second, the concept of just war theory, which had roots going back to thinkers like Augustine.
Just war.
Yeah, it provided a theological framework, a justification for using military force defensively to protect Christian communities, to reclaim lost Christian territory deemed essential to the faith, like Jerusalem. So, from their perspective, it wasn't just naked aggression.
And the First Crusade itself?
The First Crusade was arguably the most successful from their point of view. It did manage to recapture significant territory, establish Crusader states, and, most importantly for them, liberate Jerusalem in 1099.
You mentioned earlier the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim destroying churches decades before the First Crusade. How does that fit in?
Right. Al-Hakim's destruction of some 30,000 churches across Egypt and Greater Syria, including the most sacred site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, around 1009. This happened almost a century before the First Crusade.
That wasn't a response to the Crusades.
No, not at all. It's often overlooked, but it shows that severe persecution of Christians was happening well before the Crusaders arrived. It provides crucial context for understanding why the call to liberate Jerusalem resonated so strongly in Europe.
What about the later Crusades? Did they follow the same pattern?
They were generally less successful. The Second Crusade, prompted by the fall of the Crusader state of Edessa, was largely a failure. Then you have the rise of Saladin in the late 12th century. He unified Muslim forces and won a decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187.
Which led to?
Which led directly to the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin. This, in turn, sparked the Third Crusade, the one famously involving Richard the Lionheart of England.
Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. They're often portrayed almost as chivalrous rivals.
Yes, that's the popular image, especially of Saladin in the West. He's often romanticized as this uniquely noble, tolerant figure.
But the reality might be different.
The historical reality is, as always, more complex. That image owes a lot to later European writers, particularly Sir Walter Scott in the 19th century.
So what does Saladin actually do?
Well, he certainly engaged in persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt to consolidate his power. After Hattin, the captured Templar and Hospitaller Knights, the military orders were given a stark choice: convert to Islam or be beheaded. Most chose death.
Not exactly magnanimous.
Not in that instance, no. And his dying wish, according to some sources, was to continue the jihad and conquer Constantinople and Rome. Even the capture of Jerusalem in 1187. While he didn't order a general massacre like the Crusaders had done in 1099, he did impose a hefty ransom on the Christian inhabitants. Those who couldn't pay were enslaved. Thousands were. So the magnanimous Saladin narrative needs quite a bit of qualification.
What about Jewish communities during this period? How are they affected by the Crusades?
That's an important point. Sadly, some Jewish communities, particularly in the Rhineland during the very beginning of the First Crusade, the so-called People's Crusade, which was more of a disorganized mob, faced horrific attacks and massacres.
Were these attacks sanctioned?
Generally, no. Church leaders, bishops, and even the main Crusader leaders often condemned these attacks and sometimes tried to intervene to protect Jewish populations. But the popular fervor and anti-Jewish sentiment already present in parts of Europe were tragically ignited by the Crusade preaching in some instances.
So despite these efforts, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land itself didn't last indefinitely.
No, it didn't. Over time, Muslim powers regrouped, the Crusader states were gradually worn down and reconquered. The final major Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291. That essentially marked the end of the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. After the Crusader period, a new major Islamic power emerges: the Ottoman Turks.
Yes, the Ottomans. They rose from Anatolia and became arguably the most powerful and long-lasting Islamic empire. Their impact on Europe was immense.
The fall of Constantinople being a key moment.
Absolutely huge. 1453. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was a world-shattering event. It marked the final end of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, after more than 1,000 years, and it signaled a new, very potent Islamic threat right on Europe's doorstep.
And their expansion didn't stop there.
Not at all. They pushed relentlessly into the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Hungary. Vast areas fell under Ottoman rule, often accompanied by significant devastation and enslavement. This went on for centuries.
And the sieges of Vienna, they seem like critical moments in that struggle.
Definitely. There were two major sieges of Vienna. The second one in 1683 is particularly famous. The Ottomans were poised to take the city, which would have opened the way into Central Europe. It was a moment of extreme crisis for Christendom.
And that's where the Polish king comes in.
Exactly. King John III Sobieski of Poland led a combined Christian army, famously including his winged hussars, in a decisive charge that broke the siege and routed the Ottoman forces. It's seen as a major turning point, halting the Ottoman advance into the heart of Europe.
It's really striking how these historical moments, like Vienna 1683 or even Tours 732, still echo today.
They absolutely do. You mentioned Vienna. There's been recent controversy there about putting up a monument to King Sobieski. Some people worried it might be seen as Islamophobic.
Wow.
And just a few years ago, in France, near Poitiers, the site of the Battle of Tours, there was an attempted bombing. The individuals involved explicitly said they were seeking revenge for that defeat over 1,300 years ago. It shows how potent these historical narratives can remain for some.
Another major event in European history that seems entangled with this long interaction is the Spanish Inquisition. How does that fit in?
The Spanish Inquisition really needs to be understood in the context of the Reconquista we discussed earlier. After the Christian kingdoms reconquered Spain, they were left with a very large Muslim population, the Moriscos.
Who had officially converted?
Many had officially converted to Christianity, yes, but there was widespread suspicion, often justified, that many conversions weren't sincere. There's an Islamic legal principle called taqiyya, which under certain conditions, like duress, allows for the concealment or dissimulation of one's true faith.
So the authorities suspected Muslims were pretending to be Christian.
Exactly. They feared secret adherence to Islam and even plotting or subversion against the Christian state. The Inquisition was established in part as a way to root out these perceived insincere converts and maintain religious uniformity and state security.
A very controversial institution, obviously.
Hugely controversial and often brutal. It's important to note, though, that contrary to popular belief, the Spanish Inquisition actually tried significantly more people accused of being crypto-Muslims, the Moriscos, than it did crypto-Jews, the conversos.
So it wasn't just about Jews.
Not primarily, no, especially in its early phases related to the Moriscos. Now, this doesn't justify the methods or the persecution, of course, but it frames the Inquisition as another, albeit dark, consequence stemming directly from that centuries-long religious and political conflict in Spain.
It even connects to Columbus?
In a way, yes. Part of the motivation for Columbus's voyages, backed by Ferdinand and Isabella, who had just completed the Reconquista, was to find a new sea route to the east, bypassing the Muslim-controlled land routes. And there was also this lingering crusading idea that wealth from the Indies could potentially fund future efforts to reclaim Jerusalem. Even earlier explorers, like Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator, were strongly motivated by crusading ideals against Muslim powers in North Africa.
Given this long, often violent history, why do you think the way we talk about it today, especially the Crusades or the early conquests, has shifted so much? Why the tendency to downplay or revise this history?
That's a really important question. There are probably several layers to it.
Yeah.
The Protestant Reformation, for instance, led to a generally more critical view of anything associated with the medieval Catholic Church, including the Crusades.
Okay.
Then came the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and its critique of religious wars and fanaticism in general. That shaped perspectives, too.
And more recently?
More recently, you have the rise of, well, political correctness, maybe multiculturalism interpreted in certain ways, and definitely some strands of post-colonial or anti-Western thought within academia. These often tend to view historical European actions critically, while sometimes minimizing or excusing actions by non-Western powers. There's also sometimes academic pressure just to offer new revisionist interpretations, even if they strain the evidence.
What's the danger in that, in getting the history wrong?
The danger is that fake history, or heavily skewed history, creates misleading paradigms. It shapes how we understand the present. If your understanding of the past interaction is flawed, your analysis of current events involving the same groups or ideologies is likely to be flawed too. It affects policy, social attitudes, everything.
Which brings us right up to the present day and the complex social situation in Europe now, with large Muslim populations and, in some places, significant social friction.
Yes. And unfortunately, some events, like the horrific grooming gang scandals in the UK, Rotherham, being the most infamous example, seemed to reflect, in some ways, disturbing historical patterns.
How so?
While the targeting of predominantly white non-Muslim girls by gangs largely composed of men from certain Muslim backgrounds, coupled with the authorities' reluctance to tackle the issue for fear of being called racist or Islamophobic, it echoes, for some observers, historical attitudes documented within certain interpretations of Islamic law regarding the status and treatment of non-Muslim women, particularly in conquered territories or contexts of conflict.
That fear of being labeled Islamophobic seems to be a major obstacle to open discussion.
It absolutely is. It creates a chilling effect on free speech, on journalism, even on law enforcement. It makes it incredibly difficult to address real problems honestly. And there's a deep irony there, isn't there? Modern European societies, founded on tolerance and equality, struggling to confront behaviors and attitudes that seem rooted in historical, ideological frameworks that are fundamentally different.
So looking at Europe's demographic changes, what can this long history tell us about the potential challenges or the path towards genuine social cohesion?
Well, the historical patterns suggest that when you have large-scale demographic shifts, especially involving groups with very different religious beliefs, cultural norms, and crucially, differing legal or theological views about non-believers, friction is perhaps predictable.
Is peaceful coexistence impossible then?
Not necessarily impossible, but history suggests it's often been most stable when, one, the Muslim populations involved are less strictly adherent to, or perhaps less knowledgeable about, certain traditional interpretations of doctrine regarding non-Muslims, or two, when strong secular legal and social frameworks effectively override or contain those doctrines. The traditional Islamic concept of dhimmi status for non-Muslims, for example.
There's a second-class status.
Yes, with its inherent inequalities and restrictions. That concept still has influence today in the laws and social practices of many Muslim-majority countries. Think about the difficulties Christians face building or even repairing churches in Egypt, for instance. That stems directly from those traditional legal frameworks. These things create inherent tensions when transplanted into societies based on equal rights.
You used an analogy before comparing ideology and individual action, like Nazism and Oskar Schindler. Could you maybe rephrase that in this context, thinking about moderate Islam?
Sure. The analogy helps distinguish between an ideology's core tenets and the actions of individuals who nominally belong to the group associated with that ideology. Nazism, as an ideology, had core tenets of racial hatred and supremacy. Oskar Schindler was a Nazi party member, but he acted against those core tenets to save Jewish lives. He rose above the ideology.
Okay.
Similarly, if you look at traditional Islamic doctrine, texts like the Quran and Hadith and their historical interpretations, they contain specific teachings about non-Muslims, jihad, dhimmi status, and so on. A Muslim who consistently treats non-Muslims with kindness, respect, and equality might be seen as acting according to universal human values, or perhaps interpreting their faith in a more universalist way, but they might also be seen as acting in spite of or rising above certain specific traditional interpretations of the doctrine, rather than representing a moderate version of that traditional doctrine itself.
So the core texts and traditions remain influential.
They remain hugely influential for many. Even movements like the Quranists who reject the Hadith and focus only on the Quran are a very small minority. And you also have the massive global influence of funding from places like Saudi Arabia, which actively promotes very conservative, literalist interpretations, Wahhabism, that shapes discourse worldwide.
Yeah.
And then there's the concept of taqiyya we mentioned earlier.
The dissimulation.
Yes, the religiously sanctioned dissimulation. It adds another layer of complexity when trying to understand outward statements versus inner beliefs or intentions, especially in contexts perceived as hostile.
This historical perspective certainly sheds light on the reports we hear constantly about the persecution of Christians in many parts of the Muslim world today.
Yes, absolutely. What's happening today is sadly not some new aberration. It's largely a continuation of historical patterns that have persisted for centuries, albeit with varying intensity.
The Copts in Egypt, for example.
The Copts in Egypt are a prime example. Their history under Islamic rule, stretching back to the 7th century, is one of resilience, but also of enduring discrimination, periodic violence, and systemic inequality. What organizations like Open Doors report year after year, the World Watch List.
Right, listing the worst countries for Christians.
Exactly. And consistently, the vast majority of countries on that list where Christians face the most severe persecution are Muslim-majority nations. It's an undeniable pattern.
Where is it particularly acute right now?
Sub-Saharan Africa is a major area of concern. Nigeria especially. You have Boko Haram, but also increasingly attacks by Fulani militants against predominantly Christian farming communities. The scale of the violence is horrific. Villages wiped out, churches burned, people massacred. The death toll just in Nigeria over the last decade or so is estimated in the tens of thousands, maybe 70,000 or more by some counts.
And often the motivation is downplayed.
Very often. You hear narratives about climate change causing resource scarcity, farmer-herder conflicts. And while those factors might play a role, the explicitly religious motivation, the targeting of Christians as Christians, the shouts of Allahu Akbar during attacks, the forced conversions, that's often minimized or ignored in mainstream reporting.
Why is the response often so muted?
It's complex. Partly lack of awareness in the West, partly political correctness, or reluctance to criticize anything related to Islam. Sometimes Christian communities themselves are hesitant to provoke further antagonism, but the reality is grim. We see similar things happening elsewhere, the Congo recently, with Islamist groups beheading Christians. Syria is more complex because of the civil war, but Christians there have certainly suffered immensely under various Islamist factions. My own website tracks these incidents monthly based on reports from the ground. The persecution is real, it's widespread, and it's rooted in these long-standing dynamics.
So, given this difficult history and these very real contemporary challenges, what's the way forward? How can societies in Europe and the West foster genuine social cohesion? Is it even possible?
Look, I think the first step has to be honesty.
Hmm.
We need an honest acknowledgement of the historical realities, the conflicts, the conquests, yes, but also the core theological tenets within traditional Islam that do differentiate between believers and non-believers and prescribe different treatment.
So stop pretending these issues don't exist.
Exactly. Ignoring them or downplaying them in the name of political correctness or wishful thinking isn't just unhelpful, it's counterproductive. It prevents us from actually addressing the root causes of friction. A more direct, truthful approach, one that acknowledges the challenges, acknowledges the problematic doctrines where they exist, while still upholding universal principles of human rights, mutual respect, and the absolute necessity of the rule of law for everyone, that might be the only way to navigate this.
So facing the difficult truths might actually lead to better outcomes.
It's certainly a necessary precondition, I believe. You can't solve a problem if you refuse to accurately define it first. Pretending that deeply rooted historical and ideological differences are trivial or non-existent won't make them go away. It might actually make things worse in the long run.
This has been incredibly illuminating, really bringing that deep historical context to bear on understanding today. Thank you so much for sharing these insights.
The pleasure's mine. I think the key takeaway really is to see the long arc of this interaction, to understand the enduring influence of core beliefs and ideologies on all sides, and to be very wary of historical amnesia or deliberate revisionism when we try to make sense of the present.
Absolutely. It's clear this is a profoundly complex topic,
Yeah.
and one that really demands careful thought and further exploration. We absolutely encourage you, our listener, to dig deeper into the source material, seek out different perspectives.
And maybe just consider this as a final thought. How might our current social and political conversations, especially in Europe and the West, change if we had a more honest, unflinching understanding of this 1400-year history? If we honestly grappled with the interplay between historical patterns, religious doctrines, and the unprecedented scale of modern migration and integration challenges, it's perhaps the crucial question for our time.